Joining me now, Democratic strategist and former advisor to the Obama campaign, Amisha Cross, and Brendan Buck, an MSNBC political analyst who previously served as press secretary to former VP candidate Paul Ryan. Brendan, let's pick up where Jake left off there, because I'm looking at the way that Trump is going after the Harris-Walz ticket. They were very clear that they want to define the ticket in their own terms. But are they doing it this way? I mean, is this the most effective way that they can go after them?
Well, yeah, if you remember that the Trump campaign is continuing to feel like, or thinks that it's running in a primary, it makes all the sense in the world. Their entire strategy is to turn out base Republicans. And so rather than talking about the most salient issues that people care about, and as polling continues to show, those are things like the economy and inflation, talking about things that rile up Fox News voters has an effect. It just has a limited effect. Look, we have seen these polls that you're showing, the dramatic shift, which is so remarkable because for a very long time, it seemed like nothing mattered. The polls always stayed so tight. We've seen such a dramatic shift in the last few weeks. It shows you that the middle is there for the taking if somebody wanted to take it. People did not like the choice that we had. One party did something about it. And what do you know? Polls have dramatically changed. The Trump campaign does not seem to understand that they haven't changed. And they're still running the same campaign that they have been for the last 8 years.
It does feel like they are trying to copy and paste the version of what they were going to do against Biden, against Harris, and now her running mate, Tim Walz. But Amisha, in this new polling that Brendan is talking about there, it's still within the margin of error, though Harris is leading. Is there any reason the Harris campaign should be wary of these numbers?
I think the Harris campaign has been wary of these numbers from the beginning, and I would also argue that polls are a moment in time. It does not necessarily show that this momentum is going to last through November. But I do think that it's very important that Kamala Harris and her campaign have consistently said she's the underdog in this race, irrespective of these polls, because she understands that there's a lot of groundwork that needs to be done in the battleground states. There's a lot of get-to-know-you campaigning that is happening right now for both her as well as her running mate. And I think that she's also being very strategic around not only rebuilding, but expanding what was the Obama coalition of 2008. We're seeing the excitement. We're seeing demographics of various people of color groups. We're seeing younger voters. We're seeing people really get excited about this campaign. But we also know that there is a long road to November. Anything could happen between now and then. That's why she's so strategic about where she's showing up, about the types of events that she's hosting, as well as really defining what her policy goals are, in addition to elevating her vice president, who's also out here being able to have conversations with groups who, for many people, had turned off to Democrats. And I think that that's really important strategy moving ahead.
Brendan, time is a flat circle, but it has technically just been a week, I think, since this ticket has fully come together, and the tumult has resulted in a little bit of we're seeing the ground solidify. If you were the Trump campaign, what are the issues that you would be focusing on when it comes to Harris and Walz? Clearly, he's not there yet, based on what you were saying earlier, but where should he be going?
Well, I think there's all kinds of material to work with, and Kamala Harris seems to have somewhat dramatically changed a lot of her positions, and I think that she is ripe for scrutiny on those things. I think if they were more laser focused on her positions on the border and what they were in 2019 compared to now, and the fact that she was in the Biden administration when inflation took off. I think the most salient hit on Kamala Harris is that she is too progressive for this country. Most of the people in this country think we are heading in the wrong direction. And if the Trump campaign is able to make the argument, you don't like where we're headed, do you want to go further to the left? That is probably an argument they can win. But you have to be pretty focused to make that argument. And the problem is, like, there's no doubt that Donald Trump is talking about these things. But he is so undisciplined that it doesn't break through because he's talking about all these other things that are not nonsensical. So it's hard to get a message that anybody hears.
Yeah, messaging requires discipline, and just saying the same thing over and over again so that is the consistent headline. Consistency, of course, has not been the thing that we've seen from Trump, even just in the last week, let alone over the course of his career. You know, one thing that is starting to gel from Republicans, Amisha, is from J.D. Vance, who served 4 years in the Marine Corps, and he's attacked Governor Walz's military record, accusing Walz of avoiding deployment to Iraq. Walz was in the National Guard for 24 years, retired in 2005, and that was several months after his battalion received orders to go to Iraq. You posted online that this attack line is backfiring among veterans organizations. Why?
Because veterans orgs know how deployment works. They also know how retirement works. And I think that those veterans orgs, one, do not like the connotation of stolen valor, especially when it relates to a serviceman who committed 24 years of his life to military service. But in addition to that, the record does not match with what J.D. Vance is attacking attacking Walz on. We know that he put in for his retirement months before any call up for his unit was to the war. And I think that at the end of the day, one of the only reasons why that call up even happened with the National Guard specifically is because the president at the time was trying to avoid a draft, and he knew how bad that would be publicly, but also wanted to ensure that he had those numbers, those men, and those bodies. I think that it's a very, very problematic thing to try to diminish the record of somebody who served 2+ decades in the military, somebody who left honorably, someone who was known by multiple units around the work that he did there, someone who has been awarded multiple times over. That is not a stolen valor conversation. This is something that is null and void. There's a reason why those groups have called out J.D. Vance's commentary, and they have all stood with Walz here, but also acknowledging to the American public where today less than 1% have military service records themselves. It's important to acknowledge what that service actually means and how, quite frankly, disturbing it is to have someone throw an enormous amount of shade, ignorance, and falsehoods around it.
Certainly that's an attack line that we're going to be watching. But I wonder if we can just zoom out for a moment and then look ahead, because one debate got us into this present political landscape. Now we've got at least one more for sure, potentially a few more. Who heads into this debate with the upper hand? We'll go, Brendan, to you first, and then Amisha, I want your take on this.
Well, I think Donald Trump is the underdog at this point, and I understand why he wants to have debates. I mean, he was going to run out the clock when he was running against Joe Biden. I don't think he has the luxury to do that. I also think he wants to press Kamala Harris on a lot of these issues that we talked about. She's obviously not done any interviews since she's taken over the top of the ticket, and she does deserve a degree of scrutiny on some of these things. Now, whether he's able to do that again in a disciplined way, in which he doesn't alienate a bunch of people in the way that he goes about talking about it, we'll see. And I'm also not entirely confident we're actually going to have 3 debates. I think there's going to be a lot more twists and turns to come, but she is definitely in the driver's seat right now, and he seems to know that with all the flailing that he's doing.
Amisha, what do you think?
I think that the Kamala Harris campaign and the addition of Governor Walz on that ticket has really disturbed Donald Trump and his apparatus. He is known for not being disciplined. He's also known for racism and sexism, and he would not be able to get away from either of those things on a debate stage. I was at the Black Journalists Conference just a few days ago, a week ago at this point, where he attacked Black journalists, specifically Black women, when the majority in that room was also Black women. He cannot resist that. And I think that he has connoted around wanting to have multiple debates, specifically within pretty much a week and a half of each other, which is unheard of, specifically because he wants to be able to, if there is a flub, if there is a mistake, come back. But at the end of the day, this is Trump running scared. Kamala Harris has the momentum. She has the strategy. She has the campaign discipline. This is a guy who's running scared, a guy who recognizes that his rallies aren't as big as they used to be, that Kamala Harris is able to command an audience, captivate the nation. He right now is trying to do the best that he can with what he has, and what he has is a retired talking points. He has retired MAGA strategy. It's not working.